It starts with a simple idea that sounds almost too playful to be serious. What if a spy story written in a book slowly started bleeding into real life, and the author herself had no idea how close she actually was to the truth? That is the kind of strange, glossy, self aware energy that drives Argylle, a 2024 spy action thriller directed by Matthew Vaughn. On the surface, it looks like another high budget espionage adventure filled with stylish agents, dangerous missions, and big twists. But underneath all that neon polish and exaggerated action, the film tries to play a game with the audience, constantly asking what is real, what is fiction, and who is really controlling the story. The movie opens in a world that feels almost like a comic book come alive. Bright colors, exaggerated personalities, and a tone that never fully commits to seriousness or parody. At the center of it is Ellie Conway, a shy and introverted spy novelist who prefers the safety of her imagination over real human interaction. She spends her days writing about a fictional super spy named Argylle, a confident, almost mythic agent who always seems one step ahead of danger, always calm, always perfect. But the strange thing is that Ellie's fictional stories start matching real world events a little too closely. Missions she invents in her books begin to appear in actual intelligence operations. Locations she describes in fiction turn out to be real surveillance targets. People she creates on paper might not be fictional at all. This is where the film begins building its central tension. Is Ellie predicting real events, or is someone using her writing as a blueprint for something much larger and more dangerous? The casting of the film plays a major role in shaping its identity. Bryce Dallas Howard leads as Ellie Conway, and her performance is built around awkward charm and nervous intelligence. She is not a traditional action hero. Instead, she feels like someone who would panic if asked to hold a gun, which makes her sudden involvement in global espionage feel both funny and unpredictable. Alongside her, the film introduces Sam Rockwell as Aidan Wilde, a mysterious character who appears to be a spy but never fully explains whose side he is on. Rockwell brings a loose, unpredictable energy to the role, half protector, half troublemaker, always acting like he knows more than he is willing to say. The film also includes a heavily stylized version of Henry Cavill as the fictional spy Argylle, the character within Ellie's novels. Cavill plays him with polished confidence, almost like a superhero pretending to be a spy. He is not meant to feel grounded. Instead, he represents Ellie's idealized imagination of what a perfect agent should be. As the story expands, we also see supporting appearances from actors like Bryce Dallas Howard's character interacting with figures played by Bryan Cranston, Catherine O'Hara, Dua Lipa, and others, each adding different tones ranging from comedic absurdity to cold intelligence. But before the film ever reached this polished final cast, its development went through a long and unusually secretive journey. Matthew Vaughn, known for stylized action films like Kingsman, reportedly developed the idea with the intention of blending multiple genres at once: spy thriller, comedy, mystery, and metafictional storytelling. The core concept was built around a story inside a story, where fiction and reality constantly collide. The screenplay itself was written by Jason Fuchs, who constructed the narrative like a puzzle box. Early drafts reportedly focused even more heavily on the idea that Ellie's books were not just inspired by real events but were actively shaping them in real time. The production team leaned into this idea of layered reality, designing the movie so that audiences would constantly question what world they were watching. Casting decisions were also deliberately designed to create contrast. Bryce Dallas Howard brings grounded emotional energy, while Henry Cavill's Argylle is almost unreal in comparison, too perfect, too polished, almost like a fantasy version of espionage. Sam Rockwell acts as the bridge between these extremes, moving between comedy, danger, and emotional unpredictability. As development continued, the film positioned itself not just as a spy movie, but as a commentary on spy movies themselves. It plays with the audience's expectations in a very intentional way. When you think you are watching a serious action scene, it suddenly shifts tone. When you expect comedy, it suddenly becomes tense. This instability is part of its identity. Production design also reflects this layered storytelling. The world of Ellie's imagination is filled with clean, stylized action sequences, almost like a glossy video game or graphic novel. In contrast, the real world sections are slightly more grounded, though still highly cinematic. The film never fully commits to realism. Instead, maintaining a constant sense of heightened reality, filming took place across multiple international locations, each chosen to reinforce the global spy narrative. From sleek urban environments to dramatic landscapes, every location is framed to feel larger than life. The cinematography leans heavily on bold lighting, saturated colors, and dynamic camera movement, creating a sense that reality itself is slightly unstable. Even during production, there was a deliberate effort to maintain secrecy around key plot details. Marketing leaned into mystery, with trailers avoiding major reveals and instead focusing on tone, cast, and visual style. The goal was to preserve the experience of discovery for audiences, mirroring the confusion and unfolding realization experienced by the main character herself. At its core, the film is not just about espionage, it is about authorship, control, and the uncomfortable idea that stories might not belong entirely to the people who write them. Ellie believes she is creating fiction, but the world around her suggests otherwise. The film slowly builds tension around this idea, setting up a narrative where imagination and reality begin to collapse into each other. And as the opening act unfolds, the audience is left in the same position as Ellie, unsure whether to trust what they are seeing or whether the story itself is quietly rewriting the rules in real time. As the production moved deeper into execution, the film started revealing the complexity of its own ambition. What looked on paper like a fun, stylish spy adventure was actually built like a layered machine, where every scene had to serve multiple purposes at once. It had to work as comedy, as action, and as a puzzle piece in a larger metafictional structure. That balancing act became one of the biggest challenges behind Argylle. Director Matthew Vaughn approached the production with a very specific visual philosophy. He didn't want the film to feel like a grounded espionage thriller in the traditional sense. Instead, he leaned into artificiality on purpose. The sets often feel slightly too perfect, the lighting slightly too polished, the action slightly too choreographed to be real. This is not a mistake, it is intentional storytelling language. The idea is that we are constantly shifting between Ellie Conway's imagination and the world she might actually be influencing. Bryce Dallas Howard's performance becomes even more important in this section of the film's creation. During production, she had to constantly adjust emotional tone within single scenes. One moment she is playing a nervous writer overwhelmed by real danger, and the next she is forced into situations that resemble action hero territory. That contrast is not accidental. It reflects the core identity crisis of the character. She is someone who has written bravery but never lived it. Sam Rockwell's involvement also shaped a large portion of the film's tone. His character Aidan Wilde is not written as a stable guide. Instead, he is deliberately unpredictable. On set, his performance style reportedly leaned heavily into improvisational energy, giving scenes a looseness that contrasts sharply with the highly structured spy sequences. This creates a push and pull effect where the audience is never fully comfortable trusting him, even when he is doing something heroic. Henry Cavill's role as the fictional Argylle inside Ellie's books adds another layer of production complexity. His scenes are designed almost like fantasy sequences, even though they are technically part of the same film. Cavill plays Argylle with exaggerated confidence, smooth dialogue delivery, and almost mythological physicality. He does not behave like a normal human spy. He behaves like the idea of a spy that exists in fiction. This performance required a different stylistic direction from the rest of the cast, almost like shooting a movie within a movie. As filming progressed, the production design team had to constantly separate fictional reality from real reality within the same cinematic universe. Costumes played a huge role in this distinction. Argyle's wardrobe is sleek, symmetrical, and almost unreal in its perfection, while Ellie's world is more grounded, slightly messy, and emotionally relatable. Even lighting changes depending on which layer of reality the audience is supposed to be in at any given moment. Cinematography also becomes a storytelling tool rather than just visual presentation. Fast whip pans, slow motion fight sequences, and sudden tonal cuts are used to disorient the viewer in a controlled way. The film is not trying to create realism, it is trying to create controlled confusion. That confusion mirrors Ellie's internal journey as she begins to lose her grip on what she created and what already existed before her writing. Action choreography is another major pillar of the production. Instead of purely brutal combat, the film's fights often feel like stylized performances. Characters move through space almost like dancers in a carefully arranged routine. Guns, knives, and physical combat are used but never in a purely grounded way. There is always a layer of theatricality. This approach separates the film from more realistic spy franchises and pushes it closer to a comic book aesthetic. Music and sound design also contribute heavily to this identity. The score shifts between playful espionage tones and high stakes orchestral intensity. At times, it even undercuts tension deliberately, reminding the audience that the film is aware of its own artificiality. Sound effects in action scenes are exaggerated, almost cartoonish at moments, reinforcing the idea that reality inside the film is flexible. Behind the scenes, one of the biggest creative challenges was maintaining narrative coherence while still preserving surprise. Because the film depends heavily on twists and layered reveals, the editing process had to carefully control information flow. Scenes are structured so that later revelation completely recontextualize earlier moments, encouraging rethinking rather than straightforward understanding. The supporting cast adds additional tonal variety. Bryan Cranston brings a cold, authoritative energy that contrasts sharply with the more chaotic characters. His presence anchors certain scenes in seriousness even when everything around him feels unstable. Catherine O'Hara introduces a more comedic rhythm, softening the tension and adding unpredictability through humor. Dua Lipa's appearance adds a brief but striking moment of stylized charisma, reinforcing the film's obsession with glamorous, larger than life figures. One of the more interesting production decisions was how the film treats identity itself. Many characters are not fully what they seem, and the production design reinforces that idea. Lighting, framing, and even camera focus are used to subtly hide or reveal information about characters. In some scenes, the audience literally sees characters differently depending on narrative perspective. As filming wrapped, the film had already developed reputation for being difficult to categorize. It is not a pure action film, not a straight comedy, not a traditional thriller. It exists somewhere in between all of these, constantly shifting its identity. That identity crisis is not a flaw in the production. It is the point. The deeper idea behind this section of the film is simple but ambitious. Stories are not passive, they interact with the people who create them. Ellie Conway begins as a writer who believes she is in control of her fiction, but the film slowly suggests that stories can also control their authors. That inversion becomes the emotional and thematic backbone of everything that follows. And as the production layers settle into place, what emerges is not just a spy movie, but a deliberately unstable narrative experiment. One that constantly asks the audience whether they are watching a story or whether the story is watching them back. As the film moved into post production, the creative focus shifted from building scenes to shaping perception. The raw footage of Argylle was already dense with style, tone shifts, and layered storytelling, but the editing process determined how confusing, how playful, and how controlled the final experience would feel. The editing style leans heavily into contrast. Long, glossy sequences of espionage spectacle are suddenly interrupted by quieter, awkward moments involving Ellie Conway, forcing the audience to constantly readjust emotional expectations. This rhythm is not accidental, it is designed to keep viewers slightly off balance, mirroring Ellie's own psychological journey as she begins to question what is real and what is written. One of the most noticeable aspects of the final cut is how often the film refuses to settle into a single tone. A tense action sequence might suddenly be followed by a comedic pause, and a humorous moment might quickly collapse into danger. This constant tonal instability is part of the film's identity. Instead of building a predictable structure, the film behaves more like a shifting puzzle where each piece slightly changes the meaning of the last. The musical score plays a major role in controlling that instability. Composed with a mix of orchestral grandeur and modern spy thriller energy, the music constantly pushes the audience between seriousness and playfulness. At times, it fully embraces classic espionage style, bold brass, rhythmic percussion, and sweeping themes, but in other moments, it undercuts tension with lighter, almost mischievous tones, reminding the viewer that the film is always aware of its own fictionality. There is also a recurring musical identity tied to the fictional spy Argyll. His presence in Ellie's novels is often accompanied by exaggerated, heroic motifs that feel larger than life. These themes contrast sharply with the more subdued musical language used in Ellie's real world scenes, reinforcing the divide between imagination and reality. The score essentially becomes a narrative guide, signaling which layer of the story the audience is currently inside. Marketing for the film leaned heavily into mystery. Instead of revealing the full structure of the plot, promotional material emphasized secrecy, double identities, and unexpected twists. Trailers were carefully cut to avoid confirming which characters were real and which belonged to Ellie's imagination. This approach was designed to replicate the confusion at the heart of the story itself. The marketing campaign also played with audience speculation. One of the most discussed aspects online was the identity of the fictional author Ellie Conway and whether the story had deeper real world inspirations. This intentional ambiguity helped generate early curiosity even before release. The film's promotional strategy relied less on clarity and more on intrigue, encouraging viewers to enter the theater with questions rather than expectations. When the film finally released, its rollout was global and heavily stylized. It positioned itself as a major theatrical event, emphasizing spectacle and star power. The combination of Bryce Dallas Howard, Sam Rockwell, Henry Cavill, and a large ensemble cast gave it strong visibility across multiple audience segments, from action fans to casual viewers drawn by curiosity. At the box office, the film experienced a more complicated journey. Initial opening interest was driven by curiosity and marketing momentum, but audience reception quickly became divided. Some viewers were drawn to its playful tone, stylized action, and unpredictable narrative structure. Others found its constant tonal shifts and layered storytelling confusing or uneven. The domestic performance reflected this split reaction. While it opened with attention and strong discussion online, its momentum softened in the following weeks. International markets responded differently, with certain regions showing stronger interest in its spy action spectacle and star driven appeal. However, overall performance settled into a range that suggested mixed commercial success rather than runaway blockbuster dominance. A major factor influencing box office discussion was expectation. Many viewers approached the film expecting a more traditional spy franchise experience, especially given its marketing and cast. Instead, they encountered a self aware, structurally experimental narrative. That gap between expectation and reality shaped much of the early reception conversation. Critically, responses were equally divided. Some praised its ambition, visual creativity, and willingness to break genre rules. Others criticized it for being overstuffed or tonally inconsistent. But even among critics who were uncertain about the execution, there was often acknowledgement that the film was attempting something structurally bold rather than formulaic. Online reaction quickly became part of the film's identity. Memes began circulating around its twists, exaggerated characters, and the idea of a spy movie that constantly interrupts itself with self awareness. Certain scenes and character moments were re edited by fans into humorous clips, turning parts of the film into viral content. The Argylle cat subplot also became a notable meme focus, with audiences reacting strongly to its absurd and unexpected presence in a spy narrative. This kind of surreal humor helped the film maintain visibility even among viewers who were critical of its structure. In a strange way, the meme culture surrounding the film extended its lifespan in public conversation far beyond its theatrical momentum. Another recurring online discussion revolved around Henry Cavill's portrayal of Argylle. His hyper stylized performance became a point of both admiration and parody, with viewers debating whether the exaggerated spy persona was intentionally comedic or simply part of the film's heightened reality. Despite mixed reception, the film succeeded in creating conversation, which was arguably part of its design. It is not a quiet background spy film, it is a loud, self aware experiment that demands reaction, whether positive or negative. As its theatrical run settled, the film's legacy began forming not around traditional metrics of success, but around its identity as a genre blending, reality bending spy narrative. It stands as a film that prioritizes style, structure, and meta commentary over conventional storytelling comfort. And as the final pieces of its release and reception phase come together, what remains is a film that divides audiences but refuses to be ignored. A glossy, chaotic, and deliberately unstable spy story that keeps asking one question long after the credits roll. If a story can change reality, then who is really writing who? When you start looking deeper into Argylle, It becomes clear that the surface level spy story is only one layer of a much more self reflective structure. Beneath the flashy action and stylized characters, the film is constantly circling around a simple but unsettling idea. Stories are not passive entertainment, they actively shape perception, identity, and even reality itself. At the center of this idea is Ellie Conway. Her character arc is not just about a shy writer getting pulled into danger. It is about authorship losing control. She begins as someone who treats writing as a safe space, a place where she can design perfect spies like Argylle who always win, always survive, always make sense of chaos. But as the film progresses, that sense of control slowly dissolves. The world outside her books begins to behave like her fiction, or maybe her fiction was never as separate as she believed. This blurring of boundaries is the core thematic engine of the film. Ellie's journey is essentially a breakdown of certainty. Every time she thinks she understands what is happening, the narrative shifts. People she trusts become uncertain. Events she believes she understands reveal hidden layers. Even her memories and interpretations are constantly questioned. The film uses this instability to place the audience inside her psychological experience rather than outside it. The character of Argylle, played in exaggerated form by Henry Cavill, represents more than just a fictional spy. He is the embodiment of idealized control. He is what Ellie wants reality to look like: clean, decisive, stylish, and predictable. But the more the real world intrudes, the more that ideal breaks down. Argylle is not just a character, he is a contrast point for chaos. His perfection highlights how messy real life actually is. Sam Rockwell's Aidan Wilde functions as the opposite force. Where Argylle is polished fiction, Aidan is unpredictable reality. He is inconsistent, emotionally unclear, and morally ambiguous. He does not behave like a standard hero or villain. Instead, he shifts depending on the situation, forcing Ellie and the audience to constantly reassess him. His role in the narrative is to disrupt certainty, to remind us that real people cannot be written as cleanly as fictional characters. Another major theme is identity fragmentation. Nearly every major character in the film has a version of themselves that does not fully align with how they are perceived. This creates a constant tension between appearance and truth. The film suggests that identity is not fixed but layered, shaped by stories told about us and stories we tell ourselves. The structure of the film itself reinforces this idea. Instead of following a straight line, the narrative behaves like a series of overlapping realities. Each reveal does not simply answer a question, it recontextualizes everything that came before it. This creates a viewing experience where understanding is always temporary. Just as the audience settles into one interpretation, the film shifts again. One of the more subtle symbolic elements is the use of fiction writing as espionage. Ellie's books are not just stories, they function almost like intelligence documents within the film's logic. This raises an unsettling question. If writing can predict or influence real events, then where does imagination end and manipulation begin? The film never answers this directly, but it keeps returning to the idea that narrative has power beyond entertainment. Even the tone of the film reflects its themes. The constant switching between comedy, action, and emotional drama is not just stylistic experimentation, it mirrors the instability of identity and truth within the story. Just as Ellie cannot rely on a single version of reality, the audience cannot rely on a single emotional register. The ending of the film, without reducing it to a simple explanation, continues this pattern of destabilization. Instead of offering a clean resolution, it reinforces the idea that the boundary between fiction and reality has been permanently blurred. Characters are left in positions that feel both resolved and unresolved at the same time, as if the story itself refuses to fully close. This open ended structure is intentional. It pushes the audience to reconsider everything they have seen, not as a linear spy plot, but as a commentary on storytelling itself. The film is less interested in answering what happened and more interested in asking, why do we believe what we see in stories at all? From a thematic perspective, one of the strongest underlying messages is about control versus chaos. Ellie represents controlled imagination where everything is structured and purposeful. The real world represents chaos where outcomes are uncertain and people behave unpredictably. The conflict between these two forces drives the emotional core of the film. There is also a quieter commentary on the relationship between creators and their creations. Argyll, as a fictional spy, begins as something Ellie controls completely. But as the story progresses, that control becomes questionable. The film plays with the unsettling idea that creations can take on lives of their own once released into the world of interpretation and belief. Even the exaggerated style of the film supports this idea. The polished action sequences, heightened performances, and surreal tonal shifts all suggest a world that is slightly artificial. It feels like a story aware of being a constantly reminding the audience that what they are watching is constructed in terms of character arcs. Ellie's transformation is less about becoming an action hero and more about accepting uncertainty. She does not evolve into someone who fully understands everything. Instead, she becomes someone who can exist within ambiguity. That shift is subtle but important. It reframes survival not as control but as adaptation. Aiden's arc, meanwhile, reflects the difficulty of trust in unstable environments. His shifting behavior forces both Ellie and the audience to confront the fact that certainty in people is often an illusion. Whether he is ally, manipulator, or something in between remains deliberately unclear, reinforcing the film's refusal to lock identities into fixed roles. Argylle himself remains the most symbolic figure. He is less a character with development and more a representation of narrative perfection. His presence highlights everything the real world is not. In that sense, he is both essential and artificial, a reminder of what stories try to achieve, even if reality never fully cooperates. Ultimately, the film's meaning is not found in a single twist or revelation, it is found in its structure of instability. It suggests that stories are not just told, they evolve, they interfere, and sometimes they reshape the people who create them. And once that process begins, it cannot easily be reversed. By the time you step back from all its twists and shifting identities, Argylle starts to feel less like a conventional spy movie and more like an experiment in storytelling itself, one that is intentionally uneven, sometimes playful, sometimes chaotic, but always trying to keep the viewer slightly unsure of where they stand. One of the lasting impressions the film leaves is how it treats genre as something flexible rather than fixed. Spy films usually rely on clarity: who is the hero, who is the enemy, what is the mission, and what is at stake. Here, those elements are constantly blurred. A character introduced as an ally may later feel like a threat. A sequence that looks like reality may later be reframed as fiction within fiction. The film refuses to settle into the comfort of stable categories. This approach divides audiences, but it also explains why the film generates so much discussion. It is not built for passive viewing. Instead, it invites constant reinterpretation. People walk away debating what was real, what was imagined, and whether that distinction even matters inside the world of the story. Another key aspect of its identity is its relationship with spectacle. The film is undeniably designed to look impressive. Large scale action sequences, glossy cinematography, carefully choreographed set pieces, and highly stylized environments. But spectacle here is not just decoration, it is part of the storytelling language. The louder and more exaggerated the visuals become, the more the film is signaling that we are inside a constructed reality. That idea becomes especially important when you think about how Ellie Conway experiences the world. For her, reality is not stable. It behaves like a narrative that keeps rewriting itself. The film uses visual access to mirror that instability. Bright colors, sudden tonal shifts, and almost theatrical staging all contribute to the sense that reality is being filtered through imagination. Even the supporting characters contribute to this layered sense of storytelling. Each one feels slightly heightened, as if they belong to different versions of the same universe. Some are grounded and serious, others are exaggerated and almost comic book like. This inconsistency is not accidental. It reinforces the idea that the film is operating on multiple narrative levels simultaneously. When it comes to audience reception, part of the conversation around the film focused on expectations versus delivery. Many viewers came in expecting a straightforward spy thriller with a strong franchise setup. Instead, they encountered a film that constantly interrupts its own momentum with shifts in tone, structure, and perspective. That mismatch became one of the defining talking points, but over time, another interpretation emerged that the film was never trying to be traditional in the first place. Instead, it behaves more like a commentary on how modern blockbuster storytelling is constructed, how trailers, marketing, and audience expectations can shape the way a film is perceived before it is even seen. In that sense, The confusion becomes part of the design. There is also a meta layer in how the film deals with authorship. Ellie Conway is presented as the creator of Argyll's world, but as events unfold, her control over that world becomes questionable. This raises a subtle but interesting idea. Once a story is released, does it still belong to its creator, or does it become something shaped by interpretation, audience expectation, and narrative expansion? This question mirrors real world storytelling culture, especially around franchises and cinematic universes. Once a fictional world becomes widely consumed, it often evolves beyond its original intention. The film reflects that phenomenon within its own structure, turning narrative expansion into part of the theme. From a technical perspective, the film also demonstrates a strong emphasis on controlled visual chaos. Action scenes are not purely about clarity, they are about sensation. Camera movement, editing rhythm, and sound design work together to create moments that feel energetic and unpredictable, even when carefully choreographed. This contributes to the feeling that the world itself is slightly unstable. The humor in the film also deserves attention. It is not constant nor is it always straightforward. Sometimes it comes from exaggerated character behavior, sometimes from tonal contrast, and sometimes from the absurdity of the situation itself. This layered humor helps prevent the film from becoming too self serious, even when its themes become quite abstract. As for its place in modern spy cinema, the film stands somewhat apart from more grounded franchises. It does not aim for realism in the way traditional espionage stories often do. Instead, it embraces artificiality as a feature. It is closer in spirit to stylized action comedy hybrids than to procedural spy dramas. This choice is both its strength and its limitation. On one hand, it allows for creativity, unpredictability, and visual experimentation. On the other hand, it can make emotional grounding more difficult for some viewers, especially those expecting a more conventional narrative structure. Still, the film's ambition is difficult to ignore. It is not content to simply repeat familiar formulas. It tries to stretch the boundaries of what a spy film can include: fiction within fiction, unreliable perception, shifting identity frameworks, and a self aware narrative structure that constantly comments on itself. In the end, what lingers most is not a single twist or action sequence, but the feeling of instability it creates. The viewer is left in a space where certainty is always slightly out of reach. Even after the story ends, interpretation continues. At this point, there isn't a traditional next layer of plot left to unfold in Argylle in the way a standard film would continue expanding story beats. What remains instead is the aftermath, the way the film echoes after it ends, and how its pieces keep rearranging themselves in the viewer's mind. One of the most interesting after effects is how the film reframes its own earlier scenes once you understand its structure. Moments that initially look like simple spy action setups begin to feel like deliberate misdirection. A conversation that seemed comedic might later read like foreshadowing. A flashy action sequence might feel less like progress in a plot and more like a visual metaphor for instability. The film is designed so that your memory of it keeps shifting even after it is over. This is where its metafictional nature becomes most visible. The story doesn't just tell you about shifting realities, it makes you experience them retroactively. You are essentially rewatching the film in your mind without the images changing, only your interpretation of them. That's a rare narrative effect, and it is one of the reasons the film continues to generate discussion despite its mixed reception. Another important element in the film's broader identity is how it plays with the idea of the spy genre myth. Traditional spy stories often rely on competence fantasy, agents who are always in control, always prepared, always calculating several steps ahead. But here, that myth is constantly undermined. Control is fragile, plans break, identities blur, even intelligence itself feels unstable. This is most clearly contrasted between Ellie Conway and Argylle. Argylle represents the myth of perfect competence. Ellie represents uncertainty, hesitation, and human fragility. The tension between them isn't just character based, it is thematic. The film keeps asking whether perfection in storytelling or in espionage is even believable anymore, or whether audiences are more aware of the cracks behind it. Sam Rockwell's Aidan Wilde becomes crucial in reinforcing that collapse of certainty. His character refuses to fit into any clean category. He is neither fully mentor nor fully manipulator, neither stable ally nor clear threat. Instead, he exists in a shifting moral space that mirrors the film's refusal to define reality in fixed terms. Every time the audience tries to lock in who he is, the narrative gently pushes back. Even the villainous forces in the film are treated less like traditional antagonists and more like expressions of systemic ambiguity. Rather than presenting a single clear evil mastermind with a simple plan, the film disperses control across multiple layers. This makes the conflict feel less like a chess match and more like a fog of overlapping intentions where clarity is always partial. From a storytelling standpoint, this is where the film's ambition becomes most visible and also most debated. Some viewers appreciate the refusal to simplify, others feel it weakens emotional stakes. But either way, it is clearly a deliberate structural choice rather than an accident. The emotional core of the film ultimately rests not in action but in perception. Ellie's journey is about learning to exist without full understanding. She never gains complete control over the situation. Instead, she gradually adapts to uncertainty. That shift from needing clarity to surviving without it is the closest thing the film has to a traditional character resolution. Even Argylle, as a symbolic figure, does not evolve in a conventional sense. He remains an ideal, but the meaning of that ideal changes as the story progresses. What once looked like empowerment through fiction begins to look like limitation, an overly controlled version of heroism that cannot survive contact with real complexity. This is where the film's commentary on storytelling becomes more pointed. It quietly suggests that narratives built on absolute certainty, perfect heroes, clean logic, neatly resolved conflicts, may no longer match how modern audiences perceive the world. Instead, ambiguity has become part of the experience, and the film leans into that ambiguity rather than resolving it away. Visually and structurally, this is reinforced through repetition and variation. Certain ideas, motifs, and character dynamics reappear throughout the film but in altered contexts. This creates a sense that the story is not linear but recursive. It loops back on itself each time, slightly changing meaning based on what has been revealed. That looping structure is part of why discussions about the film often feel unresolved. People are not just debating what happened, they are debating what it means, and those meanings tend to shift depending on which layer of interpretation they focus on. In the end, the film's legacy is not tied to a single plot twist or dramatic moment. It is tied to the experience of instability it creates. Whether intentional or not, it becomes a film that resists being summarized cleanly. Every attempt to define it produces another angle that complicates that definition. At this stage, continuing the article in the same direction naturally shifts away from new plot content and moves into the film's broader cultural footprint. How Argylle sits in the landscape of modern blockbuster cinema and why it keeps resurfacing in discussion even after its release cycle has faded. One of the most noticeable long term effects of the film is how it became a reference point for over designed modern spy films, movies that are visually polished, structurally complex, and intentionally self aware but not always universally accessible. It sits in that category of films that feel engineered to provoke reaction rather than comfort. For some viewers, that makes it exciting. For others, it makes it frustrating. But either way, it makes it memorable. Over time, the conversation around the film started to split into two interpretations. One group sees it as an ambitious but uneven experiment, an attempt to merge comic book style storytelling with spy thriller structure and metafictional commentary. The other group sees it as a deliberately playful deconstruction of those same genres, where confusion is not a flaw but part of the design language. That divide is important because it reflects a broader shift in how audiences engage with blockbuster films today. Modern viewers are increasingly aware of narrative construction, marketing manipulation, and franchise design. In that environment, a film like this cannot rely purely on traditional storytelling. It is forced, intentionally or not, to compete with audience skepticism. Another lasting element of the film is how it handles star image versus character identity. Actors like Henry Cavill, Sam Rockwell, and Bryce Dallas Howard bring strong pre existing screen personas into the film, and those personas sometimes collide with the roles they are playing. Instead of smoothing that over, the film often highlights it. Cavill's Argylle feels almost like a heightened version of a cinematic ideal rather than a grounded character, while Rockwell's unpredictability feels like a rejection of stable screen identity altogether. This creates a subtle meta layer. The audience is not only watching characters but also watching familiar actors perform variations of expected archetypes. That adds another layer of instability to the viewing experience because recognition itself becomes part of the storytelling. The film's meme culture impact also became part of its identity. Certain exaggerated moments, tonal shifts, and character choices were quickly isolated and circulated online, often stripped from context and reinterpreted humorously. This is important because it extends the life of the film beyond its narrative boundaries. Even people who never fully engage with the story still encounter fragments of it in digital culture, in a way that mirrors one of the film's central ideas: stories escaping control. Once scenes are clipped, remixed, or reinterpreted online, they no longer belong fully to their original context. They become independent narrative fragments that evolve through audience interaction. The film, intentionally or not, ends up demonstrating that process in real time. From a craft perspective, one of the most discussed aspects remains its visual identity. The film uses hyper saturated lighting, controlled symmetry, and exaggerated set design to create a world that feels slightly artificial at all times. This is not realism, it is curated stylization. The result is a world that feels like it is always performing itself, which ties directly into the film's themes of performance, identity, and constructed reality. Even quieter scenes carry that sense of design. Conversations are often staged with precise framing and intentional blocking, making even dialogue feel slightly theatrical. This reinforces the idea that nothing in the film exists purely as natural behavior. Everything is part of a constructed narrative layer. As for its place in Matthew Vaughn's broader filmography, it represents a continuation of his fascination with stylized espionage worlds but pushed further into abstraction. Where earlier films balanced style with clearer narrative grounding, this one leans more heavily into fragmentation and metastructure. It feels less like a traditional story and more like a commentary on storytelling mechanics themselves. Over time, the film also gains a different kind of appreciation from viewers who revisit it. On a second viewing, certain elements that felt chaotic or confusing begin to appear more intentional. Foreshadowing becomes more visible. Tonal shifts feel less random and more structured. Even character ambiguity starts to feel like a deliberate design choice rather than inconsistency. This rewatch effect is one of the film's most interesting qualities. It does not fully reveal itself on first contact. Instead, it reconfigures in the viewer's memory, encouraging reinterpretation rather than immediate understanding. That is not a universal appeal, but it is a distinctive one. Ultimately, the film's long term identity is not defined by whether it is simple or complex, successful or flawed. It is defined by its refusal to stay in one interpretive position. It keeps sliding between meanings: spy film, satire, fantasy, metafiction, action, spectacle, and commentary on storytelling itself. Argylle is a 2024 spy action comedy film directed by Matthew Vaughn, working from a screenplay penned by Jason Fuchs, and it stands as one of the more curious and talked about entries in the spy genre during a period when Hollywood and streaming platforms alike were leaning heavily into star studded ensemble casts to drive interest in original intellectual property. The film brought together an enormous roster of recognizable names, including Henry Cavill, Bryce Dallas Howard, Sam Rockwell, Bryan Cranston, Catherine O'Hara, Dua Lipa, Ariana DeBose, John Cena, and Samuel L. Jackson. A lineup that on paper suggested a blockbuster event picture designed to dominate the early months of the year. Produced under the banners of Apple Studios, Marv Studios, and Cloudy Productions, and distributed jointly by Universal Pictures and Apple Original Films, Argylle represented a significant financial gamble for Apple as the technology company continued to expand its footprint in theatrical filmmaking following its prior success with films like Coda. The film's premise is built around a deceptively simple but ultimately winding conceit. A reclusive and somewhat awkward novelist who writes espionage thrillers discovers that the fictional world she has been creating on the page bears an uncanny and dangerous resemblance to a real and ongoing conflict between actual spies and a shadowy criminal organization. From this starting point, the narrative spirals outward into a web of false identities, mistaken memories, double agents, and metatextual commentary on the spy genre itself, all wrapped in the visual sensibilities that Matthew Vaughn had become known for through his work on the Kingsman franchise. The film's central character is Ellie Conway, played by Bryce Dallas Howard. an introverted and somewhat socially isolated author who has built a career writing a popular series of spy novels centered on a suave, impossibly capable secret agent named Aubrey Argylle. As the story opens, Ellie is on the cusp of completing the fifth book in her Argylle series, but she finds herself stuck, suffering from a bout of writer's block that has been exacerbated by less than encouraging feedback from her mother, Ruth. This domestic, almost mundane setup, an author struggling with a deadline and family pressure, serves as the calm before the storm, establishing Ellie's ordinary world before it is violently upended. The film wastes little time setting that disruption in motion. While traveling by train to visit her parents, Ruth and Barry, Ellie finds herself the target of an ambush. She is saved quite unexpectedly by a real spy named Aidan Wilde, portrayed by Sam Rockwell, whose rough around the edges demeanor stands in sharp contrast to the polished, debonair Argylle character that Ellie has spent years writing about. Aidan's explanation for why Ellie has suddenly become a target is, on its surface, almost absurd. A dangerous and clandestine organization known only as the Division has taken a keen interest in Ellie because her novels, ostensibly works of pure fiction, appear to predict the Division's future actions with disturbing accuracy. This revelation immediately establishes one of the film's central themes, the blurring of the line between fiction and reality, and sets up the central question that will drive much of the plot. How is it possible that a novelist with no apparent connection to the world of espionage could be writing stories that mirror real covert operations before they happen? Aidan, recognizing the urgency of the situation and believing that Ellie's still unfinished manuscript might contain clues about how to stop the division, convinces her to travel with him to England. His hope is that by working with Ellie and tapping into whatever creative or subconscious process generates her uncannily prescient plots, he can get ahead of the division before they execute whatever scheme they're currently planning. Once in London, Aidan and Ellie's mission becomes more focused. They begin searching for a device or piece of information referred to throughout the film as the master key, a term that the film uses consistently even though some versions or descriptions of the story have referred to it as the master file. This master key is described as a tool that could be used to expose the division's activities to the wider world, essentially serving as the film's classic MacGuffin, the object around which much of the plot's action and intrigue revolves. As Ellie and Aidan dig deeper into this search, the stakes escalate considerably. Ellie, who at this point in the story still has only a fragmentary understanding of what is happening to her and why, begins to suspect that Aidan himself might not be entirely trustworthy, fearing that he too might intend to harm her once she has served whatever purpose he needs her for. In a moment of panic and uncertainty, she reaches out to the people she trusts most, her parents. This decision sets up one of the film's most significant early twists. When Ruth and Barry arrive, ostensibly to help their daughter, Aidan reveals a shocking truth. Ellie's parents are not the loving, if occasionally critical, family figures she has always believed them to be. Instead, they are revealed to be operatives working for the division, the very organization that has been hunting Ellie. This revelation forces Aidan and Ellie into an immediate and violent confrontation as they must fight off Ruth and Barry in order to escape with their lives. The betrayal cuts deep, not just narratively but emotionally for Ellie's character, as the people she has spent her entire life believing to be her parents are unmasked as enemies, operatives whose entire relationship with her has apparently been built on a foundation of deception. Following this confrontation, Aidan and Ellie flee to France, putting more distance between themselves and the division while also buying time to regroup and figure out their next move. It is in France that the film delivers what is arguably its most significant and reality altering twist, the revelation that completely recontextualizes everything the audience has seen up to this point. Aidan and a former CIA deputy director named Alfred Alfie Solomon, played by Samuel L. Jackson, explained to Ellie that the Argylle novels she believes she has been writing as pure fiction are not fiction at all, or at least not in the way she has always assumed. The truth, as revealed by Aidan and Alfie, is staggering. Ellie Conway is not actually Ellie Conway. She is in reality a trained intelligence operative named Rachel Kell, whose name, when broken down, even provides a clue to the origin of the pseudonym Argylle, since the fictional character's surname appears to be derived from Argylle. According to this revelation, Rachel was captured by the division approximately 5 years prior to the events of the film and subjected to an extensive program of psychological manipulation and brainwashing, designed to convince her that she was, in fact, Ellie Conway, an ordinary novelist with no connection to the world of espionage. As part of this manufactured identity, Rachel was made to believe that two division operatives, the woman known as Dr. Margaret Vogler and a man known as Director Ritter, were actually her parents, Ruth and Barry. The film suggests that despite this brainwashing, fragments of Rachel's true memories and experiences as a spy never fully disappeared. Instead, they resurfaced in a transformed fictionalized state, finding their way into the Argylle novels that Ellie believed she was inventing from scratch. In this framework, the character of Aidan Weil, the gruff and capable spy who rescued Ellie at the start of the film, is revealed to be the real world counterpart to a character in Ellie's novels named Wyatt, suggesting that Rachel's subconscious had been processing her real experiences with Aidan and weaving them into her fiction under a different name. Similarly, Alfie, who appears throughout much of the film's earlier portions in the form of Rachel's pet cat, is revealed to be connected to this same phenomenon, with the cat serving as a kind of symbolic or subconscious stand in for Alfie within the world of Ellie's novels. The implication is that Rachel's mind, even while suppressed and reprogrammed, could not entirely let go of the truth, and that truth kept bleeding through into her creative work in disguised forms. This revelation also recontextualizes the urgency of the plot. The film establishes that with the most recent Argylle novel, the one Rachel had been struggling to finish at the beginning of the film, she was on the verge of inadvertently revealing the location or nature of the master key to the world through her fiction without even consciously realizing that she was doing so. This means that the very writer's block that opens the film, the seemingly mundane creative struggle that kicks off the story, was actually a moment of immense significance, the final barrier between Rachel's suppressed knowledge and a revelation that could change the balance of power between the division and its enemies. Armed with this new understanding of who she really is, Aidan and Rachel, no longer thinking of her as Ellie, travel to the Arabian Peninsula in pursuit of the actual master key. They succeed in retrieving it, but their victory is short lived as the division manages to corner them and forcibly returns both Aidan and Rachel to one of the organization's bases. It is here that the film delivers yet another twist, layering deception upon deception in a way that has become something of a signature for Vaughn's spy films. Director Ritter, the division operative whom Rachel had believed to be her father, Barry, reveals to Aidan and Rachel that everything they thought they understood about Rachel's allegiances has been wrong. According to Ritter, Rachel was never simply a victim of brainwashing who needed to be rescued back to her true heroic self. Instead, Ritter claims that Rachel was in fact a double agent, one of the division's most trusted and effective operatives, someone who had been working for the organization with full knowledge and loyalty. This twist throws the audience's understanding of the entire film into question, casting doubt on whose side anyone is really on. Ritter, having delivered this bombshell, then offers to personally interrogate Aidan, a process that quickly turns violent when Ritter shoots him. However, in keeping with the film's penchant for piling twist upon twist, Aidan's apparent death is revealed not to be what it seems. The shots fired by Ritter are shown to have hit non-lethal areas of Aidan's body, suggesting either that Ritter was not actually trying to kill him or that Aidan's survival was orchestrated through means the film does not fully spell out in this moment. Meanwhile, Ritter also manages to locate Alfie, the man who has been working alongside Aidan and Rachel throughout much of the film's second act. But in another reversal, Ritter reveals that Rachel herself had already sent the master key to Alfie, a clear act of betrayal against the division and a signal that whatever Rachel's true loyalties might be, she has chosen, at least in this moment, to work against Ritter and the organization he represents. As the confrontations escalates, Ritter attempts to intercept and interrupt the transmission of the master key to Alfie before it can be completed, recognizing that if the information reaches Alfie, it could be used against the division. However, before he can succeed in stopping the transmission, Ritter is fatally wounded in a moment that ties back to one of the film's recurring motifs: Rachel's cat. The cat, which has been a near constant presence throughout the film and which carries deeper symbolic meaning given its connection to Alfie within the world of Rachel's novels, scratches out Ritter's eyes, a brutal and almost darkly comic moment of violence that results in Ritter's death and removes one of the film's primary antagonists from the board. Having dealt with Ritter, Aidan and Rachel manage to escape to the exterior of the division facility, which the film reveals to actually be an oil tanker, a massive vessel that has been serving as a secret base of operations for the organization. Their goal at this point is to make use of the tanker's satellite connection in order to complete the transmission of the master key to Alfie, finishing what Rachel had started before Ritter's interference. But the division is not finished yet. Margaret, the woman Rachel had once believed to be her mother, Ruth, makes one final attempt to regain control of the situation by activating a mental trigger code, a piece of programming embedded in Rachel's mind during her years of brainwashing, designed to force her into a state of compliance or aggression against her will. This trigger causes Rachel to turn on Aidan, attacking him despite presumably not wanting to do so on a conscious level, illustrating just how deeply and dangerously the division's manipulation of Rachel's mind had been embedded. The situation is resolved through the intervention of a character named Kara, played by Ariana DeBose, described in the film as a former CIA agent and as a sister in arms to both Rachel and Aidan. Kara's appearance at this critical juncture allows her to kill Margaret, finally ending the influence of the mental trigger and freeing Rachel from the compulsion that had turned her against Aidan. The film provides additional context for Kara's character that adds yet another layer to its already dense web of fictional and real world parallels. Kara had previously been believed to be dead, the apparent victim of a mission gone wrong, but in truth she had been secretly saved by Rachel at some point in the past. Furthermore, the film reveals that these events, Kara's apparent death and her secret survival, along with a fictionalized identical version of Kara's character, had also found their way into Ellie's novels, just as Aidan's experiences had been transformed into the character of Wyatt and Alfie's presence had been transformed into the cat. This reinforces the film's central conceit that Rachel's subconscious had been continuously processing and disguising the truth of her real life within the pages of her supposedly fictional Argylle series. With Margaret dead and Rachel freed from the division's control, Alfie finally receives the completed transmission of the master key, achieving the goal that Aidan and Rachel had been working toward for much of the film. In the climactic action that follows, Aidan detonates the division's headquarters, the oil tanker that has served as their base, bringing a fiery and explosive end to the organization's primary stronghold and, by extension, dealing a major blow to their operational capabilities. In the aftermath of these dramatic events, the film returns to a quieter, more reflective tone as it follows Rachel resuming her identity and career as a novelist, publishing what is described as her final Argylle novel. The film stages a public reading of this novel, an event that brings the story's themes of fiction and reality colliding to their most literal conclusion yet. During this reading, the real Argylle, the character upon whom Rachel's entire fictional series has apparently been based in some form, reveals himself in person. This moment is portrayed as a shock to Rachel, who reacts with confusion and surprise, suggesting that even after everything she has learned about her own true identity and the strange ways in which her subconscious experiences shaped her fiction, the literal physical existence of Argylle as a real person is something she had not anticipated or prepared for. The film does not end with this reading, however. It includes a mid-credits scene that shifts the timeline dramatically, taking the audience back 20 years before the main events of the film. In this scene, a young version of Argylle, played by Louis Partridge, is shown being recruited as an agent of Kingsman, the secretive British intelligence organizations that serves as the centerpiece of Matthew Vaughn's other major film franchise. This sequence reframes the entire Argylle story as having roots that stretch back into the world of Kingsman, suggesting that the very first novel in Ellie Rachel's Argylle series was in some sense based on the real-life experiences of this young Kingsman recruit. The scene ends with an on-screen message announcing that Argylle, Book 1, the movie is coming soon, an explicit signal of Vaughn's intentions for the franchise future and a direct tie to the prequel film he had been developing. Beyond the central trio of Ellie, Rachel, Aidan and Alfie, The film features a substantial supporting cast that fills out its world of spies, double agents, and division operatives. Sofia Boutella plays a character named Sabah al-Badr, while Dua Lipa in her acting debut portrays a character called Lagrange. Catherine O'Hara takes on the role of Ruth, one half of the parental deception at the heart of the film's twists, while Bryan Cranston plays Director Ritter, the division leader whose true allegiances and ultimate fate form such a pivotal part of the plot's later stages. Rob Delaney appears as Deputy Director Powell, while Jing Lucy plays Lena, a character described as a love interest for Argylle within the fictional world of the novels. Tomas Paredes appears as Carlos, a field agent working for the division, adding to the roster of operatives that populate the film's espionage landscape. The film also includes a notable cameo from Richard E. Grant, who plays a character named Fowler, described as the director of the spy organization that exists within the fictional Argylle novels themselves, a character explicitly based on Ritter within that fictional framework, adding yet another layer to the film's recursive structure of fiction reflecting reality and reality reflecting fiction. Ben Daniels also appears in a smaller role as a bartender and spy at an establishment called the Kingsman Arms, a clear and deliberate nod connecting the world of Argylle to the Kingsman franchise, reinforcing the shared universe that Vaughn has been building. The production history of Argylle stretches back to mid 2021 when the project was first announced, with Matthew Vaughn confirmed as the director, attached to helm and produce the film through his production company Marv Studios. In the months following this initial announcement, the full ensemble cast was revealed, and it was reported that Jason Fuchs had written the screenplay. Notably, Dua Lipa, who would go on to make her acting debut in the film, also contributed original music, including work on the title track and the broader score, marking a unique dual role for the pop star within the project. One of the most significant early developments in the film's production came in August 2021 when Apple TV Plus purchased the rights to the film in what was reported at the time as a massive $200 million package deal. This figure became a point of considerable confusion and debate in the months and years that followed, as various industry publications reported the production budget itself as being $200 million, with The Hollywood Reporter going even further, suggesting that some sources place the actual cost as high as $250 million. Matthew Vaughn himself pushed back firmly against these figures, expressing genuine bafflement at how such a number could be accurate for the film as it existed, stating that he didn't understand how one could spend $200 million on the project unless the result was something resembling a 5-hour CGI spectacle. Adding further clarity to the situation, industry journalist Matthew Belloni, writing for Puck News and discussing the first matter on The Ringer, later reported that the film's actual production budget was considerably less than the widely circulated $200 million figure, explaining that this number actually represented the price Apple paid for the licensing and distribution rights to the film, rather than reflecting the cost of physically making it. Belloni's reporting suggested that the public perception of Argylle as a $200 million production was in essence a significant misunderstanding, conflating a rights acquisition deal with a production budget. Vaughn has spoken about the circumstances surrounding the film's creation, noting that the COVID-19 pandemic, with its disruptions to the usual rhythms of the film industry, gave him the time and space needed to develop Argylle. He has described the film as his personal homage to the action thrillers of the 1980s, citing films like Die Hard and Lethal Weapon as touchstones for the tone and energy he was aiming to capture. When discussing his decision to cast Henry Cavill in the lead role of Argylle, Vaughn explained his reasoning by drawing a connection to one of cinema's most iconic spy characters, James Bond. He stated that he needed someone who felt as though they were born to play Bond, a quality he saw clearly in Cavill, and that by casting him as Argylle, he was effectively able to nick that quintessential leading man energy before James Bond himself could claim it. Vaughn further elaborated on the tone he was going for with Cavill's performance, describing Argylle as a larger-than-life action hero portrayed with a knowing wink to the audience, and explicitly distinguishing this approach from the tone of his Kingsman films. Principal photography on Argylle began in August 2021 in London, with George Richmond serving as the film's cinematographer, continuing his collaboration with Vaughn. Filming then proceeded across various locations throughout Europe, taking advantage of the continent's diverse architecture and landscapes to create the globe-trotting feel typical of the spy genre. According to an update Henry Cavill posted on the social media platform then known as Twitter, filming wrapped in December 2021, giving the production a shooting schedule of roughly 4 to 5 months. The production made extensive use of studio facilities in Greenford, Park Royal, and Bovingdon, all areas in or around London, to construct and film many of the film's interior sequences and elaborate set pieces. In addition to these UK based studio shoots, the production also captured background footage in both Greece and the United States, further expanding the geographic scope of the film's visual world beyond what was filmed on the primary European sets. One of the more unusual aspects of the film's marketing and pre release buzz centered on the character of Ellie Conway and the question of who had actually written the in universe Argylle novels that inspired the film. During the initial announcement of the project, it was reported that Ellie Conway had written the book upon which the film's script was based, presenting her as a real author whose work had been adapted for the screen. However, this claim came under scrutiny in September 2022 when the Hollywood Reporter published an investigation questioning Conway's existence altogether. According to this reporting, journalists were unable to verify that Ellie Conway was a real person, and their attempts to make contact with her directly as well as through a publicist and a talent agent were unsuccessful, leaving the question of her identity shrouded in mystery for a significant period. This mystery only deepened once the film's trailer was released, which revealed that Ellie Conway was not simply the author of the source material in some abstract, behind the scenes sense, but was actually the protagonist of the film itself. This revelation set off a wave of speculation across social media as users began attempting to piece together clues about who Ellie Conway might really be, given that she did not appear to exist as a conventional published author prior to the film's announcement. A significant portion of this speculation coalesced around the theory that the singer-songwriter Taylor Swift had secretly written the Argylle book using Ellie Conway as a pen name. This theory was fueled by a number of supposed connections between Swift and the Argylle project, with one frequently cited piece of evidence being the fact that both Ellie Conway, as depicted in the film, and Taylor Swift were each known to have a Scottish fold cat, a relatively distinctive breed that became a point of fixation for fans trying to connect the dots. Matthew Vaughn directly addressed and denied this theory, stating clearly that Ellie Conway had no connection to Taylor Swift. However, in a twist that perhaps explains why the theory gained as much traction as it did, Vaughn also acknowledged that Swift had, in fact, influenced certain creative decisions in the film, specifically confirming that her ownership of a Scottish fold cat had played a role in the decision to feature that particular breed of cat so prominently within Argylle's story, given the cat's significant symbolic and plot relevant role as a stand in for the character of Alfie. Bryce Dallas Howard, who portrayed Ellie Conway in the film, offered her own perspective on the swirling speculation, suggesting that the character of Argylle, and by extension perhaps the broader creative world of the film, could be seen as having been unconsciously inspired by Taylor Swift, even if there was no direct, literal connection between Swift and the fictional author Ellie Conway. The mystery surrounding the authorship of the Argylle novels was eventually given a more concrete resolution of sorts in February 2024 when authors Terry Hayes and Tammy Cohen revealed that they had been the ones to actually write the tie-in novel associated with the film. This tie-in book, published under the title Argylle and credited to Ellie Conway as the in-universe author, was released by Bantam ahead of the film's theatrical premiere, hitting shelves on January 9, 2024. The book carried the ISBN 9780599366016 and was promoted through Penguin Random House, representing a significant piece of the film's broader marketing and world-building strategy, blurring the lines between the film's fictional author and the real-world creative team responsible for bringing that fiction to life. The marketing campaign for Argylle was substantial, reflecting the scale of the production and the high expectations that Apple and Universal had for the film's theatrical performance. According to reporting, Apple and Universal together spent approximately $80 million on promoting the film, with the two companies splitting the cost evenly, each responsible for funding 50% of the total marketing budget. This level of investment in marketing underscored just how significant a release Argylle was intended to be, positioning it as a major theatrical event rather than a smaller or more niche release. The film's score was composed by Lon Wolf, marking his first collaboration with Matthew Vaughn as a director. The score was recorded at the famed Abbey Road Studios in London during late 2022, lending the production an additional air of prestige given the studio's storied history in the world of music and film scoring. The completed score was released on February 2nd, 2024, coinciding with the film's release date in the United States, and was made available through Platoon and Marv Music, the latter being closely tied to Vaughn's own production company. Argyle's theatrical journey began with its premiere at the Odeon Lux Leicester Square in London on January 24, 2024, a high-profile launch befitting a film of its scale and star power. Following this premiere, the film opened more widely in the United Kingdom on February 1, 2024, before its release in the United States the following day, February 2nd, 2024. The path to this release date had been set somewhat earlier, with an announcement in June 2023, confirming that the film would receive a theatrical release through Universal Pictures and Apple Original Films on this February 2024 date, before eventually making its way to Apple's streaming service, Apple TV Plus, on April 12, 2024. This release strategy reflected a now familiar pattern for major studios and streamers in the post pandemic era, combining a theatrical window with a subsequent transition to streaming, allowing the film to generate revenue across multiple platforms and reach audiences who might not attend a traditional theatrical screening. As previously noted, the film's marketing campaign cost approximately $80 million, with Universal responsible for half of that total. The film's distribution arrangement included a notable financial detail reported by Deadline Hollywood, which explained that Universal's financial recoupment process involved first collecting back the marketing costs it was owed from the film's box office earnings, and only after recovering those costs would Universal then collect its standard 8% distribution fee. This arrangement highlights the complex financial structures that often underlie the distribution of major studio films, particularly in situations involving co financing and shared marketing responsibilities between a traditional studio and a streaming platform. When it came to actual box office performance, Argyle's results painted a picture of a film that, despite its star power and substantial investment, struggled to find a broad theatrical audience. The film ultimately grossed $45.2 million in the United States and Canada, combined with $50.9 million from international territories, for a worldwide total of $96.1 million. To put this figure into perspective relative to the film's reported costs, Variety noted that for a film with the kind of traditional studio backing and reported budget associated with Argylle, it would typically need to gross somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million worldwide simply to break even, a target that Argylle fell drastically short of reaching. Even when accounting for the additional revenue the film would eventually generate through its streaming release on Apple TV Plus. The film's opening weekend performance in the United States and Canada had initially been projected with cautious optimism, with industry estimates suggesting the film could gross somewhere between $15 million and $20 million from its release across 3,605 theaters. In practice, the film's opening day results came in at $6.4 million, a figure that included $1. 7 million generated from Thursday night preview screenings, the early showings that typically precede a film's official wide release. Over the course of its full opening weekend, Argylle went on to earn $17.5 million, a result that did place it at the top of the box office for that particular weekend, technically making it the highest grossing film in North America during that period. However, this nominal victory was viewed with significant skepticism by industry observers. The Hollywood Reporter offered a particularly pointed assessment, noting that if a legacy Hollywood studio had released a film with a reported $200 million budget and achieved results comparable to Argylle's opening weekend, that studio would face intense criticism and scrutiny for the perceived failure. The publication went further, raising broader questions about whether Apple would be able to continue releasing films with such substantial budgets if their box office returns continued to fall so far short of expectations. The film's box office struggles did not improve in its second weekend of release. Argylle saw its earnings drop by 63% compared to its opening weekend, bringing in $6.5 million dollars during its second week in theaters. Despite this steep decline, the film remained in first place at the box office. Though this achievement was tempered by the fact that the overall box office environment during that particular weekend was described as moribund, suggesting that Argyle's continued position atop the rankings was as much reflection of weak competition as it was of any genuine staying power on the film's part. Variety, in its coverage of the film's performance during this period, characterized the gross figures from Argyle's first 2 weeks in theaters as dismal, a stark assessment that reflected the broader narrative forming around the film's theatrical run as a significant disappointment relative to its scale and ambition. By its third weekend, Argyle's box office earnings had fallen further still, with the film bringing in $4.7 million dollars. This third weekend performance placed the film behind two newcomers to the box office during that period, Bob Marley, One Love and Madame Web, both of which managed to outperform Argylle despite the latter, Madame Web also facing its own significant criticism and disappointing reception. The fact that Argylle, a film built around an ensemble cast of major stars and backed by a massive marketing campaign, was being outpaced by films like these only reinforced the narrative of the film's theatrical underperformance. Critical reception of Argylle was overwhelmingly negative, a reality reflected clearly across the major review aggregation platforms that track such sentiment. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film earned a positive rating from just 33% of the 306 critics whose reviews were tracked by the site, with an average rating of 4.9 out of 10, figures that place the film firmly in rotten territory according to the site's classification system. The critical consensus published by Rotten Tomatoes captured the mixed to negative sentiment succinctly, describing the film as one that derives some entertainment value from its energetic and somewhat ridiculous take on the spy thriller genre, while ultimately undermining that entertainment value through an overly complicated plot and a running time that overstays its welcome. Metacritic, which calculates scores using a weighted average system across the reviews it aggregates, assigned Argylle a score of 35 out of 100 based on 56 critic reviews, a figure that the platform classifies as indicating generally unfavorable reviews, further reinforcing the picture of a film that critics by and large did not respond well to. Audience reception, while somewhat more positive than the critical response, was still relatively middling. Audiences surveyed by CinemaScore, a polling service that gathers reactions from moviegoers on their way out of opening weekend screenings, gave Argylle an average grade of C dots on the service's letter grade scale that runs from A plus down to F. Similarly, audiences polled by PostTrack, another service that gathers exit poll style audience reactions, gave the film a rating of 3 out of 5 stars. While these scores were not catastrophic, they certainly did not suggest the kind of enthusiastic word of mouth that might have helped the film overcome its negative critical reception and build momentum at the box office in the way that some other critically maligned but audience beloved films have managed to do. In terms of more detailed critical commentary, Forbes contributor Eric Kine offered an overview of the general thrust of the negative reviews, noting that critics tended to focus their criticisms on several recurring issues. The film's length, which many felt was excessive for the kind of story being told. The sheer number of plot twists packed into the film's runtime, which some critics felt became exhausting or even self-parodying after a certain point. And the film's heavy reliance on computer generated imagery during its action sequences, which some felt undermined the visceral impact that practical effects might have provided. Kane's summary went so far as to characterize the overall critical response as effectively labeling Argylle a parody of the spy genre, though apparently not always in a way that critics found to be intentional or successful. Brennan Klein, writing for Screen Rant, offered a somewhat more balanced characterization of the overall reviews, describing the critical reception as mixed rather than uniformly negative. Klein specifically highlighted the polarized nature of critical reactions to the film's meta elements, the layers of self awareness and genre commentary built into the story's central conceit of a novelist whose fiction mirrors reality. While these elements clearly worked for some critics and not for others, Klein noted that one area of broad consensus among critics was praise for the cast's performances, suggesting that whatever issues critics had with the film's script, structure, or visual execution, the actors themselves were generally seen as doing solid work with the material they were given. Some of the most pointed and memorable criticism came from Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian, who awarded the film just 1 star out of a possible 5. Bradshaw's review was notable for its sharp, memorable language describing Argylle as an unbearably self satisfied smirk of a spy caper from Matthew Vaughn, a phrase that captured a sense of the film's perceived tonal problems, suggesting that its self aware, winking approach to the genre came across as smug or self congratulatory rather than genuinely clever or entertaining. Bradshaw's review was far from the only severely negative take on the film. Numerous other reviews echoed similarly harsh sentiments, contributing to the broader narrative of critical disappointment that surrounded the film's release. Not every negative review focused exclusively on the film's shortcomings, however. Jackson Weaver, writing for CBC News, offered a perspective that acknowledged the film's failures while also pointing toward what he saw as its more interesting aspects. Weaver conceded that the real world meta backstory surrounding the film, encompassing the mystery of Ellie Conway's identity, the Taylor Swift speculation, and the broader questions about authorship and authenticity that swirled around the project before its release, was, in his assessment, considerably more interesting than the actual storyline depicted on screen. This sentiment that the film's off screen drama and mystery overshadowed its on screen narrative became something of a recurring theme in discussions of Argyll's reception. Similarly, Katie Walsh of the Los Angeles Times, while also offering a fairly critical assessment of the film overall, found some positive elements worth highlighting. Walsh described the film's central premise, the idea of a novelist discovering that her fiction mirrors a real spy conflict, as amusing, and she specifically noted that she enjoyed Sam Rockwell's presence in the film, suggesting that his performance as Aidan Wilde stood out as a bright spot even within a film that she otherwise found wanting in various respects. Despite the wave of negative critical reaction, Matthew Vaughn has spoken about his own surprise at how poorly the film was received by critics, particularly given that test screenings for Argylle prior to its release had reportedly gone well. Vaughn has described his own perception of the film at the time of its completion as a fun, feel good movie, language that stands in fairly stark contrast to the tone of much of the critical commentary the film ultimately received. In subsequent comments, Vaughn has also noted that the film performed well on streaming platforms following its transition to Apple TV Plus, suggesting that whatever issues the film faced in terms of theatrical box office and critical reception, it may have found a more receptive audience once it became available for home viewing. Vaughn has indicated that he would be open to making another Argylle film if given the opportunity, signaling that despite the rocky reception of this first installment, his enthusiasm for the broader concept and franchise potential of the Argylle world has not necessarily been diminished. The film's awards trajectory, while limited, reflects the mixed nature of its overall reception, with recognition coming from both more prestigious and more critically oriented award bodies as well as from organizations known for highlighting films and performances considered among the year's weakest. At the Golden Raspberry Awards, often referred to informally as the Razzies, and known for recognizing what its voters consider to be the worst achievements in film each year, Argylle received nominations in 2 categories during the ceremony held on February 28, 2025. Bryce Dallas Howard received a nomination for Worst Actress for her performance as Ellie Conway Rachel Kill, while Ariana DeBose received a nomination for Worst Supporting Actress for her role as Kara. These nominations placed Argylle within a broader conversation about some of the most poorly received major releases of its year, a designation that stands in interesting contrast to the film's star power and the considerable resources invested in its production and marketing. On a more positive note, the International Film Music Critics Association recognized Lon Ball's score for Argylle with a nomination for Best Original Score for an Action Adventure Film, with this recognition coming at a ceremony held on February 27, 2025. This nomination suggests that even amid the broader critical disappointment surrounding the film as a whole, certain individual elements, in this case Bolfi's musical contributions, were seen as worthy of recognition by at least some segments of the industry and critical community. Additionally, Argylle received a nomination at the Saturn Awards, an organization that has historically focused on recognizing achievements in science fiction, fantasy, and horror filmmaking, though its categories have expanded over the years to cover a broader range of genre filmmaking. At the Saturn Awards ceremony held on February 2nd, 2025, Argylle received a nomination for Best Action Adventure Film, placing it in competition with other genre films released during the same period. This nomination represents another instance of the film receiving at least some institutional recognition, even as its overall critical reputation remained largely negative. Looking beyond the reception and performance of this first film, Orgyle was always conceived as more than a standalone project. As early as July 2021, when the film was first announced, reports indicated that Argylle was intended to be the first installment in a franchise consisting of at least three films, signaling that Matthew Vaughn and his collaborators had ambitions for the Argylle property that extended well beyond a single movie. This franchise ambition was further solidified in March 2022 when it was confirmed that the original film would be followed by two additional installments, completing what was described as a film trilogy. The shape of this planned trilogy became clearer in October 2023 when Vaughn provided additional details about his plans for the sequels. According to Vaughn's comments at that time, the second film in the planned trilogy would actually function as a prequel to the events of the first Argylle film, an approach Vaughn described by referring to it as the first Argylle novel, suggesting a direct narrative and thematic connection to the books that exist within the world of the films. This prequel would explore the origins of how the character of Argylle came to become a spy in the first place, delving into his backstory and formative experiences. Vaughn also indicated that the third film in the planned trilogy would follow on from whatever narrative threads were established in this prequel, suggesting a continuous and interconnected story arc spanning across the planned films rather than a series of disconnected standalone adventures. This prequel concept was directly seeded within the original film itself through its mid-credits scene. As described earlier, this scene depicts a young version of Argylle, portrayed by Louis Partridge, being recruited as an agent of Kingsman, with this sequence set 20 years prior to the main events of the film. The on-screen text that appears during this scene announcing Argylle, Book 1 the movie as coming soon, served as the first explicit confirmation to audiences that this prequel storyline was already in development and represented a concrete piece of the franchise's planned future at the time of the first film's release. Following the release of Argylle, Vaughn provided further confirmation of these prequel plans in February 2024, stating definitively that the prequel film was in active development, with Louis Partridge confirmed to star as a younger version of the Argylle character during what the film describes as his formative years, essentially depicting the journey that would eventually lead to the character becoming the version of Argylle portrayed by Henry Cavill in the original film. Perhaps the most ambitious aspect of Vaughn's plans for the Argylle franchise, however, extends beyond the Argylle films themselves and into the broader landscape of Vaughn's filmmaking career. In October 2023, Vaughn announced his intentions to create a larger, interconnected spy-themed shared universe to be developed through his Marv Studios production company. According to Vaughn's vision for this universe, it would encompass not just the Argylle films but also the existing Kingsman franchise, which Vaughn had already established as a successful and well-regarded series of films prior to Argylle's development. Beyond these two known franchises, Vaughn also indicated plans for an unnamed third franchise that would form part of this same interconnected universe. Vaughn's stated intention was for the new upcoming films within each of these series, Kingsman, Argylle, and the as yet unnamed third franchise to eventually culminate in some form of crossover event, bringing characters and storylines from across these different series together in a way that would mirror the kind of interconnected universe building that had become increasingly common in major franchise filmmaking during this period. The connection between Argylle and Kingsman was already hinted at within the original film itself, both through the mid-credit scene depicting young Argyll's recruitment into Kingsman and through the smaller but still significant detail of Ben Daniels' character appearing as a bartender and spy at an establishment called the Kingsman Arms, a direct and intentional nod linking the two franchises' fictional worlds together. Taken as a whole, Argylle represents a fascinating case study in the modern landscape of blockbuster filmmaking, particularly as it pertains to the increasingly significant role that streaming platforms and technology companies have come to play in financing and distributing major theatrical releases. The film's journey from its starry ensemble cast and substantial budget, through its elaborate marketing campaign built partly around the mystery of its protagonist's real identity, to its ultimately disappointing box office performance and largely negative critical reception, captures many of the tensions and challenges facing original big budget spy films in an era increasingly dominated by established franchises and pre existing intellectual property. At the same time, the film's ambitions, both in terms of its own internal narrative complexity and in terms of the broader shared universe that Matthew Vaughn has expressed hopes of building around it, suggest a filmmaker and a studio unwilling to be deterred by a single film's underperformance, with plans for prequels, sequels, and crossovers continuing to move forward even in the face of the disappointing reception that greeted this first installment in the Argylle story. Argylle in a meaningful way because the film itself is structured to resist linear continuation. Instead, what naturally remains is how the film's ideas keep expanding outside the story into audience interpretation, franchise speculation, and the way it fits into modern pop culture memory. One of the most interesting after effects is how the film feeds into the modern franchise mindset, even when it doesn't behave like a clean franchise starter. A lot of spy and action films today are judged not just on their individual story, but on whether they successfully build a universe. This film complicates that expectation by constantly questioning whether its own universe is stable enough to expand. It introduces layers of fiction within fiction, but never fully commits to explaining how those layers would scale into a traditional series structure. That uncertainty becomes part of its identity. Instead of clearly setting up sequels in a straightforward way, it leaves behind narrative fragments, characters, ideas, and tonal spaces that feel expandable but not neatly organized. This creates a strange situation where audiences can imagine continuation, but the film itself never fully guarantees what that continuation would even look like. Another angle that keeps the discussion alive is the contrast between expectation and intention. Many viewers approach the film expecting a conventional spy thriller with a clear central mystery and structured payoff. What they received instead was a story that constantly shifts interpretive frames. That gap between expectation and experience is one of the main reasons the film continues to be debated rather than simply categorized. Over time, this has led to a more layered reassessment. Some viewers began to see the film not as a failed attempt at clarity but as a deliberate challenge to how clarity itself functions in blockbuster storytelling. Others still see it as overcomplicated or uneven. Both readings exist simultaneously and neither fully cancels the other out. What makes the film especially persistent in conversation is that it invites reinterpretation without ever locking down a final meaning. Each attempt to define it, whether as parody, satire, action spectacle, or metafictional experiment, only captures part of its structure. The rest keeps slipping away into ambiguity. That is why discussions about it often loop back on themselves. Even the character dynamics contribute to this effect. Ellie Conway's journey resists traditional closure because her development is not about reaching certainty but learning to function without it. That type of arc does not produce a clean endpoint, it produces an ongoing state of adjustment. Similarly, Aidan Wiles' ambiguity prevents the audience from fully stabilizing the emotional center of the story. Argylle, as a symbolic construct, never becomes just a character, so he also cannot be fully resolved. This means the film structure doesn't end so much as it disperses. Instead of a single conclusion, it offers multiple possible interpretations that coexist without fully merging into one definitive answer. From a cultural standpoint, this is part of why the film continues to be referenced in discussions about modern blockbuster experimentation. It sits in a category of films that try to push beyond straightforward genre boundaries even when the execution divides opinion. It becomes a talking point not just for what it is but for what it attempts to do. In online spaces, the film's fragmented identity actually works in its favor. Different scenes and ideas circulate independently, sometimes as humor, sometimes as analysis, sometimes as aesthetic inspiration. These fragments take on lives of their own, detached from the full narrative. That fragmentation mirrors one of the film's underlying ideas. Stories do not remain intact once released. They evolve through repetition, reinterpretation, and cultural recycling. That concept becomes almost more important than the specific plot itself. Whether intentional or not, the film demonstrates how modern audiences interact with narrative content in a nonlinear way. People don't just consume stories from beginning to end anymore. They break them apart, remix them, and reframe them. In that sense, the film's most lasting impact might not be its box office performance or critical split, but its role as an example of how unstable modern storytelling can become when layered with metastructure, genre blending, and audience expectation. But what can still be explored is the afterlife of the film, how it behaves once it leaves the screen and enters conversation. One of the biggest long tail effects is how the film keeps getting reframed depending on who talks about it. For some viewers, it becomes a stylish but messy spy experiment. For others, it becomes a satire of spy storytelling itself. And for another group, it becomes almost like a puzzle box that rewards rethinking rather than immediate understanding. The interesting part is that none of these readings fully cancel the others. They overlap, which keeps the film unstable in public memory. That instability is actually what gives the film its lasting conversational energy. Most blockbusters are quickly locked into a general consensus, good, bad, or average, and then fade. This one resists locking. Even people who disliked it often still find themselves explaining it, comparing it, or debating what it was trying to do. That ongoing need to interpret it is part of its footprint. Another layer of its long term presence is how it reflects modern media behavior. Today, audiences don't experience films just once in isolation. They experience them through clips, discussions, edits, reactions, and memes. In that environment, a film like this doesn't survive as a single narrative, it survives as fragments. A single exaggerated scene, a tonal shift, or a surprising character choice can circulate independently of the full story. That means the film effectively becomes modular in culture. People don't always remember it as a complete beginning to end experience. They remember pieces of it. Those pieces then get reinterpreted, often humorously and sometimes even critically, in ways that extend far beyond the original intention. There's also an interesting contradiction in how the film is positioned versus how it is received. On one hand, it clearly aims for high style entertainment with recognizable stars and big action set pieces. On the other hand, it constantly undermines that straightforward entertainment structure with self awareness and narrative instability. That contradiction is part of why it feels hard to categorize, and that difficulty in categorization is what keeps it alive in discussion spaces. People keep returning to it not because it is fully solved, but because it is not easily solved. It resists being reduced to a single takeaway. Even the idea of understanding the plot becomes secondary over time. What remains more interesting is how the film manipulates expectation itself. It trains the viewer to expect one kind of story, then shifts that expectation repeatedly. After a while, the experience becomes less about following events and more about adjusting perception. In that sense, the film's real subject is not espionage or fiction writing. It is interpretation itself. It shows how unstable meaning can be when a story is built to constantly reframe itself. And once you notice that pattern, it becomes hard to look at the film in a single fixed way again. That is why even extended explanations, breakdowns, and analyses eventually circle back to the same conclusion. The film is designed to be reread, not just watched. In the last decade, big studio action films have increasingly leaned into two opposite directions at the same time. either extreme realism or extreme stylization. This film clearly chooses the second path but pushes it further by adding metafiction on top of stylization. That combination is what makes it feel unstable to many viewers. It is not just stylized, it is aware that it is stylized and it keeps reminding you of that fact. This creates a layered viewing experience where the audience is never fully allowed to settle into immersion. In traditional spy films, immersion is the goal. You forget you are watching a constructed story. Here, immersion is constantly interrupted by design choices that feel slightly too polished, too symmetrical, or too self aware. That interruption becomes part of the meaning. Another way to understand the film is through the idea of controlled artificiality. Everything in it feels constructed. The characters, the missions, the emotional beats, even the romantic or comedic moments. But that artificiality is not accidental. It is part of the language the film uses to talk about storytelling itself. It suggests that modern narratives are no longer invisible machines. They are visible systems that audiences actively decode while watching. This is also why the film often feels like it is speaking in multiple registers at once. One scene might behave like a serious spy thriller, another like a parody, another like a fantasy sequence, and another like a psychological drama. Instead of choosing one tone and sticking with it, the film layers them. That layering produces friction, and that friction is what many viewers interpret as confusion, but it can also be read as intentional design. When you look at Ellie Conway's journey through this lens, it stops being just about a writer pulled into espionage and becomes something closer to a metaphor for authorship in the digital age. Writers today don't fully control how their stories are received, interpreted, clipped, or transformed once they enter the internet ecosystem. The film reflects that loss of control by literally turning fiction into something that leaks into reality and back again. Even Aidan Wild and Argylle can be read as parts of that same idea. One represents unstable reality, the other represents idealized fiction. Ellie exists in between, constantly trying to reconcile the two. That triangle forms the emotional structure of the film even when the plot seems to be moving in different directions. Over time, this kind of structure tends to age differently than conventional films. Movies with clear plots are often remembered for their story beats. Films like this are remembered for the experience of watching them. The uncertainty, the shifting tone, the feeling of trying to keep up with something that refuses to fully stabilize. That is why discussions about it tend to remain open ended. People don't just argue about what happened in the story, they argue about what kind of film it even is. That classification problem becomes part of its identity. And in a broader sense, that might be the most modern thing about it. It reflects a media environment where audiences are constantly interpreting, remixing, and reframing content rather than consuming it passively. The film doesn't just tell a story, it demonstrates that process in its structure. So, even at the end of all analysis, breakdown, and interpretation, the film doesn't really close. It keeps echoing in fragments, scenes, ideas, tonal shifts, and contradictions that don't fully merge into a single answer.